The cop thought he could humiliate a black man in uniform without consequence, until the general made one call that brought the Pentagon to his doorstep. It was just supposed to be a brief pause. General Carlton DeHaze had driven this stretch of Highway 280 between Albany and Americas, Georgia, dozens of times before. It wasn't new to him. The curves, the long patches of nothing but trees, the occasional small-town gas station with one dusty pump. He knew the landscape. But today, his GPS had gone haywire after a recent update. So, when he spotted a gravel pull-off just past a faded green sign that read, Ellaville for Michigan, he slowed down and rolled to a stop. He put the car in park and tapped his phone screen, military-grade encrypted, the kind of device that would shut down entirely if tampered with. He was wearing a plain polo and slacks, no rank on display. His jacket, with insignia stitched neatly above the breast pocket, lay folded on the back seat. He didn't think he needed it. 2 minutes, that's all he needed. But the sound of crunching gravel behind him made his head lift. Rearview mirror, cop car lights already spinning, though there hadn't been a siren, a beat-up cruiser with faded lettering on the side, Lee County Sheriff. The driver's door opened, and a tall woman with blonde hair tucked into a bun stepped out. Aviator sunglasses, one hand resting on her holstered sidearm. She didn't approach slowly. No cautious good afternoon. No license and registration, sir. She marched straight to the driver's side and tapped hard on the window. Tap, tap, tap. Carlton lowered it halfway. Afternoon, officer. What are you doing out here? She snapped. Pulled over to check my GPS. She squinted, looked past him into the car. Where you headed? He glanced at her name tag. Wilburn. Her voice was sharp. Her tone wasn't curiosity. It was control. Just correcting my route, he said calmly. Wilburn stepped back slightly and unclipped the holster. I'm gonna need you to step out of the vehicle. Checking my GPS. You're on private land. This is a known area for illegal dumping. You fit the profile. The profile? She didn't answer, just stepped back farther and put her hand fully on the grip. Carlton exhaled through his nose and slowly opened the door. He was used to being stared down in Iraq, in Bosnia, even in Washington, D.C. conference rooms with people who'd never worn the uniform. But this wasn't protocol. This wasn't proper. I'll step out, he said, his voice even, but I want to be clear. I've done nothing wrong. You're being uncooperative. His brow furrowed. I've complied with every word you said. Wilburn walked him to the rear of his car. No backup, no body cam that he could see. Her radio crackled, but she didn't respond. She ordered him to place his hands on the trunk. He hesitated. Ma'am, I'm a federal officer, he said. My ID is inside my vehicle. Please allow me to retrieve it. I said hands on the trunk. She grabbed his arm and turned him forcefully. His palm slapped against the warm metal. She kicked his legs apart. He didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice, but he said something then, softly. You're making a mistake. But she didn't listen. From the road, a pickup slowed. A woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window just enough to hold up her phone. A teenager in the back was already filming. No one intervened, but they watched, because there was something off about it. Something in the silence. In the way the man didn't flinch. In the way the officer seemed more eager to assert power than ask questions. Wilburn was breathing hard, not from effort, from adrenaline. But she didn't know who she was dealing with, not yet. But something was about to shift, and it would start with a single request. I'm not going to repeat myself, Officer Wilburn barked, one hand still hovering near her gun. You're being detained. Carlton didn't move. He kept his hands on the trunk, calm, measured. Then, I respectfully request that you call your supervisor or allow me to retrieve my ID from the vehicle. You don't make requests right now, she snapped. You wait. From the corner of his eye, Carlton could see the teenager from earlier now standing outside the truck, phone still recording. The kid's father stood beside him, arms crossed, watching, saying nothing yet. Quiet tension floated in the air, thick like the humidity rolling off the trees. I'm not resisting, Carlton said again, slower this time. But I do need to identify myself. I'm Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes. My identification is in my briefcase inside that car. Wilburn scoffed. You expect me to believe that? He let that hang for a second. You don't have to believe it. Just check. But she didn't. Instead, she moved to the side, radioing something in. Her voice was low, muffled by static and nerves. She used the words suspicious male and possibly armed. That last part made Carlton turn his head slightly. I'm not carrying a weapon, he said. Wilburn glared. You're military, right? You people usually are. Carlton blinked slowly. You people. She ignored him. Her focus went back to the radio. She was asking dispatch to send backup to County Road 19. Possible situation developing. Carlton didn't interrupt. His years of training taught him that the fastest way to diffuse arrogance was to let it collapse under its own weight. He looked past her toward the truck. The man in the driver's seat now had his arms resting on the window frame. His expression had changed from passive concern to something harder to read. The bystanders weren't just curious anymore. They were uncomfortable. You're escalating something that doesn't need to be, Carlton said gently. You don't tell me how to do my job. I'm asking you to do it by the book. She stepped closer. Are you threatening me? His eyes narrowed slightly. No, ma'am. I'm advising you. Wilburn's lips curled for half a second like she thought that was cute. Then she grabbed for his wallet, still in his back pocket, and yanked it out. She flipped through it quickly, glancing at each card without really reading. Then she froze there. Tucked behind a department ID was a Pentagon-issued security clearance card, Level 4. She didn't say anything for a moment, but Carlton saw her jaw shift. Where'd you get this? She muttered. I earned it over 30 years of service. She closed the wallet and stepped back, but not far enough to be obvious, not far enough to admit error. You could have just said that in the first place. I did. Her face flushed, but not from the sun. You still can't park here. I wasn't parked. I was pulled over adjusting my route. She turned away, as if suddenly remembering her cruiser. Carlton could see her weighing it all, how this looked, what the footage might show, and what it might not. You'll need to wait here for the responding deputy. Fine, but once he arrives, I'd like to make a phone call. She turned back, skeptical. You calling your lawyer? No, Carlton said. I'm calling the Department of Defense. She stared at him, waiting for a smirk, some punchline. There wasn't one. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. In the distance, a faint siren started up. Another unit finally responding, but it was still at least 10 minutes out. And in those 10 minutes, everything was going to change. This wasn't going to be a quiet story swept under the rug. Too many people were already watching. The sirens were closer now, bouncing off the trees in short bursts. But Officer Wilburn wasn't waiting. Her grip on control was slipping, and she knew it. Carlton could see it in her pacing, the way she checked over her shoulder at the growing group near the roadside. 3 cars now, all pulled over. Nobody was talking, just filming. She wasn't thinking like a cop anymore. She was reacting like someone who felt cornered. "Turn around," she ordered. Carlton didn't move. "I've already identified myself." "You're still interfering with a lawful investigation." "I'm not interfering. I'm standing here unarmed and cooperating." She reached out, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. "You're resisting." He clenched his jaw but didn't fight. "This isn't necessary," but it didn't matter. She pulled his arm behind his back and slammed the cuffs on tight. The metal dug into his wrist. Gasps echoed from the roadside. The teenager had moved closer. He whispered something to his father, who didn't answer but raised his own phone to start filming too. "Everything's being recorded," Carlton said, his voice low, not a threat, just the truth. "You think that matters?" Wilburn hissed. "It always does, sooner or later." She pushed him forward, forcing him toward her cruiser. The gravel underfoot shifted. Carlton didn't stumble. He didn't resist. But she was rough, and he could feel it, not just in her grip, but in her voice. She was trying to prove something, maybe to herself. She opened the back door and shoved him in without a word. No Miranda rights, no explanation. "You're going to regret this," a voice said. It came from the man with the teenager. He hadn't moved, but his voice was steady. Southern accent, maybe mid-40s. Wilburn snapped, "Mind your business, sir." "I am," the man said. "This is my business now." Wilburn slammed the cruiser door shut and stormed to the front of her vehicle. She leaned inside, fumbling with the radio, but her voice was shaky now. Carlton sat in the back, hands cuffed behind him, breathing through his nose. He focused on each second. 1, 2, 3. Slow and steady. He didn't know who Wilburn was trying to impress, dispatch, the cameras herself, but she was unraveling. He could hear it, in the panic laced through her words as she described him to the responding units. She still hadn't checked the credentials in full, hadn't verified the Pentagon contact number, hadn't even noticed the small seal stitched into the collar of the jacket in the back seat, which would have told her everything. But someone else had. The teenager walked to the edge of the road and zoomed in with his phone. "It says U.S. Army on the jacket," he whispered. "You got that?" his dad asked. "Yeah, the badge, the stars, everything." A second siren joined the first. Carlton looked out the window. 2 more cruisers pulled up behind Wilburn's, one from the county sheriff's office, another from the state patrol. Out stepped Deputy Lamar Boyd, a tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard and a heavy build. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't rush. He walked to Wilburn, who met him halfway, arms crossed tight. Carlton couldn't hear their exchange, but Wilburn's hands were flying in the air. Boyd tilted his head slightly, then glanced toward the cruiser, toward Carlton. He approached the vehicle slowly and opened the back door. "Sir, I need to ask your name." Carlton looked up. "Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes." Boyd blinked. "Did she see your ID?" "She had it in her hand." Boyd nodded once and shut the door without saying anything more. He turned to Wilburn. They moved off to the side, low voices. Wilburn's posture shifted, stiff, defensive. Boyd looked toward the crowd, then back at her. A few seconds later, Boyd returned and opened the door again. "Sir," he said, "is there anyone you'd like to call?" Carlton nodded. "Yes, one person." Boyd reached into his pocket, pulled out his own phone, and handed it over without hesitation. Because this wasn't just about correcting a mistake anymore. It was about accountability. Carlton sat in the back seat, cuffed, holding Deputy Boyd's phone awkwardly in both hands. The cuffs didn't make it easy, but his fingers were steady. He knew the number by heart. There were only 3 people in the entire Department of Defense he ever called directly. This one was a direct line to someone who had cleared his missions across 4 continents. It rang once, twice. Major Kendall speaking. This is General Carlton Hayes. I'm being unlawfully detained by local law enforcement in Schley County, Georgia. I'm in the back of a cruiser. I need verification sent immediately. There was a pause, then, General Hayes, are you secure for now? I need them to verify my ID and credentials. There are multiple bystanders recording this. Officer failed to follow protocol from the start. I'm concerned this may escalate. Understood. Stay on the line. I'm alerting the Pentagon liaison to DHS and military police. The voice changed. A click. A new voice came through. This is Commander Reeves, sir. We're tracking your coordinates now. I have your military plate registration pulled up. Local authorities will receive contact from us in under 10 minutes. Carlton exhaled. Thank you, sir. Hang tight. And thank you for keeping calm. Carlton didn't answer. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Deputy Boyd. Through the open door, Boyd took it, glanced at Wilburn, still hovering near her own vehicle, and walked away to make a call of his own. Carlton heard bits of it. Yes, sir. That's what he said. Confirmed. Understood. I'll stand by. Carlton leaned back, watching through the window. Wilburn hadn't come any closer. Her expression was rigid, but her eyes darted constantly between the phone screens aimed her way and the man sitting quietly in the back seat. 5 minutes passed. Then came the sound of new tires on gravel. But these weren't cruisers. 3 black SUVs, no markings but unmistakably federal. Windows tinted darker than legal. The kind of cars that moved like they had the right of way everywhere. One stopped just ahead of the police line. The second parked directly behind Wilburn's cruiser. Doors opened in perfect sequence. 2 men in dark suits, earpieces barely visible. Another, in full Army dress uniform, stepped out of the lead vehicle. That was Colonel Errol Gaines, a name known well inside military circles, and one that Wilburn had likely never heard. He walked straight past Boyd, straight past Wilburn, and opened the back door himself. "Sir," Gaines said, his voice calm but tight. "You all right?" Carlton nodded. "Fine. Just bruised pride." "We've got it from here." Gaines turned to Boyd. "Who's in charge here?" Boyd lifted a hand, but his face said he wasn't happy about any of this. "I've been here 10 minutes, he said. "That officer," he motioned toward Wilburn, initiated the stop. Gaines walked over to Wilburn, who finally stiffened and tried to compose herself. "Do you know who that man is?" he asked her plainly. She squared her shoulders. "He didn't provide proper ID until you put him in cuffs. I was acting on suspicion. He refused to comply. He gave you his name, his title. You held his federal ID. That's a 3-star general you locked in a car." Wilburn tried to speak again, but her voice caught. The weight of it was sinking in. "I suggest you don't say another word," Gaines added. "This is being reported to your department, your sheriff, and the state attorney general." Wilburn's mouth opened, closed, no sound. Deputy Boyd quietly stepped to the side and spoke into his radio, asking dispatch to bring in the county sheriff. He didn't bother looking at her. Carlton stepped out of the cruiser on his own. His wrists were red, the skin slightly torn from the pressure of the cuffs. He didn't complain, didn't even rub them. A few of the bystanders had moved closer, staying silent, unsure of what would happen next. "Sir," Colonel Gaines said to him, "would you like to press charges?" Carlton looked at Wilburn, then at the growing crowd behind her. Phones were still rolling. His voice was steady. "Not yet. I want her held accountable through proper channels. Let the public see it, because some lessons don't need shouting. They just need to be seen. The crowd had thickened. Word had spread fast. First through whispers between passing cars, then through social media. The videos, raw and unedited, were already making the rounds before the sun began to dip low in the sky. Officer Wilburn stood near her cruiser, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She didn't speak. She didn't look at anyone. But you could feel the shift. What started as her show of power was now a silent collapse. The badge on her chest no longer carried authority. In that moment, it was just a patch of metal under judgmental eyes. The Schla County Sheriff, Roger Nix, arrived 10 minutes later. His truck rolled up slow, dust trailing behind him, lights off. An older man in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered with a noticeable limp. He didn't exit his vehicle right away. Just sat there, watching the scene. The federal SUVs, the silent officer, the general standing tall in front of the black sedan. When he finally stepped out, the silence was immediate. Even the birds seemed to pause. "Somebody want to tell me what the hell is going on out here?" he asked. Not yelling, but with the tone of a man who was used to being the loudest in any room. Without raising his voice, Colonel Gaines stepped forward. "Sheriff Nix, I'm Colonel Errol Gaines with the Department of the Army. One of your officers unlawfully detained a general." Sheriff Nix looked from Gaines to Carlton, then to Wilburn. "Tracy, that true?" She opened her mouth, hesitated. He refused to comply. "His vehicle was suspicious. I followed department procedure." "No," Gaines interrupted. "You checked the ID he gave you." "I didn't think it was real." Nix turned slowly. "Didn't think it was real? Tracy, this man could have you dismissed with one call. And he hasn't. That alone should tell you something." Wilburn's face flushed again, but she said nothing. Sheriff Nix stepped closer to Carlton, extending a hand. "General Hayes," he said, "apologies for what happened on my highway. I don't have words strong enough." Carlton shook it firm. "No grudge in my grip. Just exhaustion." "Appreciated, Sheriff," he replied. "But what happens next isn't about me. It's about what she did when she thought no one important was watching." The sheriff looked over his shoulder at the crowd. "Well, plenty of folks saw, and I got a feeling a lot more will." Colonel Gaines nodded in agreement. "We'll be filing a formal complaint through DOJ channels. Her conduct wasn't just reckless, it was illegal." Wilburn took a half-step forward, like she wanted to say something in her own defense, but she saw the cell phone still pointed her way. And she didn't. Not a single word. Sheriff Nix's side. "Tracy, I'm putting you on immediate administrative leave. Hand over your badge and firearm." She looked like she'd been punched in the chest. "Sheriff, that's not a request." Her hands moved slowly, first to the badge, then to her belt. When she placed both items in Nix's hand, he didn't even look at her, just turned back to the group of onlookers, holding her badge like a weight. "We'll let the investigators finish this, but let me be clear," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This ain't how we treat people in my county. I don't care who you are. No one deserves what I saw in those videos." The teenager from earlier stepped forward, holding his phone. "Sir, do you want me to send you a copy?" He gave him a faint smile. "End it, son. Thank you for filming." The kid nodded, proud but quiet. Carlton turned toward his car. The jacket still sat in the back seat. He opened the door, slipped it on, and adjusted the collar. The stars on his shoulders glinted just slightly in the fading light. Wilburn turned her back and walked to her cruiser, but she wasn't driving. Deputy Boyd followed her and took the keys from her hand. She wasn't going anywhere without answering questions first, because this was no longer a traffic stop. It had become a statement. By the next morning, the footage had already reached national news. What began as a 30-second clip uploaded by a teenager named Miles Riordan turned into a 2-minute stitched video viewed over 2 million times in less than 12 hours. The hashtags weren't subtle. General Hayes, Dershasio, Schley County, was profiling on camera. News vans lined the shoulder of Highway 280. By noon, their satellites pointed to the sky like it was some kind of crime scene. Except no crime had happened. At least not from the man who'd been cuffed. General Hayes had quietly left the scene the night before, choosing not to speak publicly. No press conference, no angry interview, just a short private call to his wife, followed by a long quiet drive to Fort Benning. He never raised his voice, never called for protests, and that, in its own way, made the story louder. The sheriff's office released a statement, clean and sterile, stripped of meaning. We are aware of the incident involving Officer Tracy Wilburn and an unidentified motorist. The matter is under internal investigation. They left out the fact that the unidentified motorist had more command experience than their entire department combined. But the people knew. By the second day, protests started forming outside the sheriff's office. Not thousands, but enough to rattle windows, enough to make it on every local station across Georgia. Veterans stood out front, holding photos. Hayes in uniform, Hayes in the field, Hayes at the White House being handed a medal by the president. The weight of it started pressing on every name tied to the county. Reporters found out about Wilburn's previous complaints. 3 formal grievances in the past 2 years, all dismissed quietly. 2 involving black drivers, 1 involving a single mom who said Wilburn followed her home and issued her a ticket for improper attitude. All of it came roaring back. Wilburn remained silent. Her lawyer issued a generic denial. My client acted in accordance with her training and did not violate any established procedures. But there was no training that justified what the public had seen. No procedures that explained cuffing a man without cause after being handed federal ID. Meanwhile, General Hayes kept his head down. He didn't seek interviews, didn't post statements. His only public comment came during a small veterans forum in Columbus, Georgia, 3 days later. It wasn't even supposed to be covered by media, but someone from the crowd recorded it anyway. He stood at a wooden podium in a church hall, wearing his uniform, hands folded in front of him. I've faced hostility on foreign soil. I've worked under administrations that didn't want me in the room. But I've never been made to feel smaller than I did on that Georgia roadside, he said. Then he paused. But I won't carry anger. That's not what this country needs. What we need is accountability, and more importantly, honesty. We can't fix what we pretend doesn't exist. The room stood up in silence, not applause, just quiet acknowledgement. 2 days after that, Sheriff Roger Nix announced the internal investigation had concluded. Tracy Wilburn was terminated. The county cited excessive use of force, failure to follow protocol, and misuse of authority. But behind closed doors, Nix said something different to his staff. He said she got caught doing something we all knew she'd been doing. That's the part that should shame us. Her termination didn't silence the noise, but it did change something. Schools began hosting discussions on respect and power. Local papers ran editorials, not just about racism, but about blind obedience. The Reardon family, the ones who filmed it all, were invited to Washington to be recognized for civic courage. As for Carlton Hayes, He returned to Fort Benning and resumed his duties. But the next time he addressed new cadets, he told them one thing: "You wear this uniform with honor, but some people will still see what they want. Don't ever let that stop you from standing tall, because sometimes justice isn't loud. It's steady, and it never forgets." 3 weeks later, the dust had settled. But the story hadn't faded. It came up in college classrooms, small-town barbershops, Sunday sermons. People weren't just talking about what happened. They were asking why it keeps happening. Why a man could serve his country for over 30 years, command thousands, lead soldiers into battle, and still be mistaken for a threat because of what someone thought they saw. General Hayes never leaned into victimhood. That wasn't his nature. But he also didn't pretend like it hadn't happened. He believed in transparency, quiet dignity, leading by presence, not volume. He declined several televised interviews, but accepted an invitation to speak at a leadership conference in Tallahassee. The auditorium wasn't full of generals or press. It was filled with teachers, first responders, and high school students, everyday people. He stepped up to the microphone, wearing a simple dark suit. No medals, no stars. "I want to talk about restraint," he began. "Not silence, not passivity, real restraint, the kind that requires strength. Because when you're wronged, when you're humiliated, everything in you wants to hit back. But power isn't measured by how hard you hit. It's measured by how much you choose not to." A pause. "You can't control how people see you, but you can control how you respond when they get it wrong. And that choice, that's where real power lives." Someone in the front row, a young EMT, raised her hand. "How did you stay so calm that day?" He smiled faintly. "Because my life wasn't in that moment. It was in everything that came before it." Later, someone asked if he was angry. "Yes," he answered, "but I don't carry it, I use it. Anger, when carried, weighs you down. But when you use it right, it makes you sharper. It makes you speak when it counts." Back in Schley County, things had shifted. A new training requirement was implemented for every officer, focused not just on policy but on perception. Deputies were required to take implicit bias training, not as punishment, but as correction. Sheriff Nix, despite his flaws, made the decision to bring in independent consultants, people who had never worn a badge but had lived through profiling. Community panels were formed, conversations began. They weren't easy, but they were necessary. Tracy Wilburn disappeared from the headlines. She moved 2 counties over, and according to one source, she found a job in private security. No badge, no gun. Just a uniform with her name stitched on the chest. As for the Reardon family, they returned home to their regular life. But Miles, the teenager with the camera, kept filming. He started a YouTube channel where he interviewed veterans, teachers, and neighbors about integrity and justice. His first video, titled "I Didn't Know Who He Was, But I Knew What Was Wrong," hit 500,000 views in the first week. Carlton watched it from his office one evening, quietly. When the video ended, he clicked off his screen, stood up, and walked outside. The air was cool, the sky still holding on to that orange-pink edge of sunset. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt certain that staying calm had made all the difference. In the end, it wasn't the rank on his shoulder that exposed the injustice. It was how he carried himself while being disrespected. And it wasn't a press conference or speech that moved the needle. It was restraint. It was decency. It was truth filmed on a phone, shared by strangers, that forced a small corner of the world to see itself differently. Because sometimes the greatest form of protest is standing still while everyone else is watching. If this story moved you, or made you think twice about how quickly we judge, take a moment to share it. Speak up. Record it. Say something when something feels off. And if you believe more stories like this should be told, subscribe.